Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the July DV New South Wales sector chat. There'll be a few people, I'm sure, kind of trickling in, but it's great to see we already have many DV New South Wales members with us today. It's my pleasure to welcome you all and our guests to our sector chat today. These monthly events are an opportunity to hear updates from DV New South Wales, to receive information from guest speakers about intersecting initiatives and projects, and to connect with other DV New South Wales members. We are going to have time for questions and discussion towards the end of today's event, and we're keen to hear what you're observing on the ground, as this information informs the advocacy that we undertake on your behalf. I would like to acknowledge that I'm on Dharawal country today and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that the land we're all on was never ceded and always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Before I introduce today's guest speaker, the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner, I'll just spend a few minutes providing some DV New South Wales updates. We were pleased last week to co-host our 4th annual regional forum, which was attended by close to 150 members, including many DV New South Wales members, the New South Wales Minister for the Prevention of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, as well as the Shadow Minister, other MPs, their staff and government departments. This year, our regional forum was focused on gender and disaster, and the DV New South Wales team are putting together a summary report which collates the key themes and recommendations, and further will collate all the recommendations from previous regional forums that are yet to be actioned by the government. A recording of that event will be available, so be sure to read your weekly e-newsletter. There have been some really fabulous wins to celebrate in the past month, with the New South Wales Government announcing indexation for funding so services can keep up with rising costs, as well as funding extensions for several domestic and family violence pilots that were due to end on the 30th of June, including the 20 specialist children's workers in crisis refuges. DV New South Wales will continue advocating for ongoing funding for pilots and hold the government to account on their promise to deliver 5-year contracts for the sector. We also celebrated the increase from 2 to 5 nights temporary accommodation after successful advocacy from DV New South Wales and other peaks. Another win, following ongoing federal advocacy by DV New South Wales and so many others, was the increased payments for temporary visa holders experiencing violence to up to $5,000 through the Red Cross program. This is an increase from the previous $3,000 limit and aligns with the payment that residents are entitled to. While this increase is much needed, DV New South Wales continue to advocate for immediate protection through the migration system, access to social security, including Medicare, social housing, and long-term sustainable funding for specialist services for women on temporary visas who are experiencing violence. Our collaboration with DCJ, the Women, Family and Community Safety Team, continues, with DV New South Wales input into several of the commitments from the New South Wales Domestic and Family Violence Plan, which are currently well underway, including the Workforce Survey and the Workforce Development Strategy, as well as the development of the New South Wales Primary Prevention Plan. So we'll likely have updates on those pieces of work in the coming weeks and months. Also recently, Delia and Bridget had opportunities to provide some specialist input regarding the nuances of coercive control on a filmed panel alongside other stakeholders. And this footage is going to be used to train frontline general duties and specialist officers in the New South Wales Police Force as they prepare for the implementation of coercive control legislation. So some powerful conversations were held on that panel, which explored the difficulties around both the legislation and identifying coercive control. So we're really looking forward to continuing this important work with police, particularly as we draw closer to the implementation of the coercive control legislation. So those are our DV New South Wales updates for this month, and now we're going to move on to today's topic and guest speaker. So we are joined this morning by the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner, Dr. James Cockayne, who is joined by lived experience advisor Sarah to present the Commissioner's strategic plan. We are looking forward to hearing about the planned actions to address modern slavery in New South Wales and gain a better understanding of the intersection between modern slavery and domestic and family violence. We know this is an important issue with an estimated 41,000 survivors of modern slavery in Australia, and there are likely things that we can all be doing to support the collective action. We will have some discussion time following the presentation, so please feel welcome to pop any questions that you have in the chat as they come to mind, and we'll use those to guide our discussion at the end. So thanks so much for being here to speak with us, James and Sarah. I'm handing over to you.
Thanks, Elise. Lovely to be with you, and thank you for the update on all the fantastic work that's being done. So many important things going on, and I think what you'll see coming through in the presentation that Sarah and I are about to give is that we see real synergy between the emerging work around anti-slavery in New South Wales and the very important work going on in the domestic violence space. In a nutshell, there's a lot of overlap empirically in the experiences of people with modern slavery. They're often people who have experienced or go on to experience domestic violence. And also legally, there's a close proximity between coercive control, as it's understood in New South Wales, and the forms of exploitation that fall within the basket of offences described as modern slavery offences in New South Wales and indeed at the federal level, because most of those offences involve coercion, fraud or manipulation as a means to exploitation. So coercive control plus certain types of exploitation gets you into modern slavery territory. I should begin by sharing my screen, actually. And while I'm doing that, perhaps, Sarah, you'd like to say a quick hello before we get into the guts of the presentation.
Hi, everybody. Really glad to be here. I'm Sarah. I'm the Lived Experience Advisor for the Office of the Anti-Slavery Commission. I guess this particular group of people is particularly close to my heart because it was a domestic violence situation that led to my particular experience of exploitation and modern slavery sort of coming about. So yeah, really glad to be here.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, hopefully you can all see the screen now. I'm just going to take it that you can, but sing out please if there's any issues. So what Sarah and I would like to do today is share with you the new strategic plan that we have recently released and that's been under development for many months. I was appointed to the role just on the 1st of August last year, so we're just coming up to 12 months of the role existing, and we've been building a team that's embedded within the Department of Communities and Justice that supports the work of the Commissioner. We're now about a dozen people. I am independent of government. I report to Parliament, not to any minister. I have a 5-year statutory term. So about 20% of the way through already, but it's taken some time, obviously, to staff up and get into this. But we're very pleased to be able to now share a strategic plan for the next 3 years. I should begin also by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation. And I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and any First Nations peoples that may be with us today on the call. I think when we acknowledge country in the modern slavery space, it's actually very important to stop and think what that means. It means that we're acknowledging that there are elders, there are people who have survived through practices that today would be modern slavery under the law. And what we've seen in this space is increasingly significant ownership of this concept of trafficking and slavery by survivors, for example, of the stolen generations, and a recognition that the journeys of recovery and healing that they have been on and that they continue to be on are really journeys of healing and recovery from modern slavery experiences, and that there's actually a lot that we in the anti-slavery space can do not only to support that, but to learn from that. The magnificent art that you see here on the screen is actually from a survivor of the Kinchela Boys Home outside Kempsey, where up to 600 boys between 1924 and 1970 experienced practices that today we would call modern slavery. This is his dreaming from his home country, and Uncle Richard very kindly shared with us permission to use this artwork in relation to the strategic plan. I think it's just incredibly powerful image, and one that speaks to the incredibly powerful journey that that those uncles have been on and continue to be on, and we look forward to continuing to support them as they work to develop the site of the Kinchela Boys Home into a memorial and healing centre. So what are we talking about when we talk about modern slavery in New South Wales? Well, I might hand over to Sarah to pick up on this, and then we'll go forward from the notes that you have, Sarah.
I guess one of the things that we've recently heard with the new estimate that's come out is that there's an estimated 41,000 people living in modern slavery in Australia, with more than 16,000 of those likely to be living here in New South Wales. I think for many people that's a really shocking number, and I hear from so many people whenever I talk about this that they just don't realise that it happens here. So we've heard about specific cases of workers that have been trapped in forced labour on farms in regional New South Wales and in domestic servitude in urban households.
We've heard about women and children, obviously, made vulnerable through domestic and family violence, and indeed often that's intertwined with homelessness or the threat of homelessness. We've heard about women and children who've been groomed and coerced into sexual exploitation. Some of those cases we've heard about are grooming and exploitation occurring in person, if I can put it that way. And in other cases, we hear about grooming and exploitation being facilitated online.
In the course of the other conversations that we've heard about cleaners and security guards working in office blocks that have been caught in the grip of debt bondage.
We've heard about women and girls that have been forced to marry here and overseas, which obviously has significant implications for work in the domestic and family violence space.
We've also heard about people that have been living with a disability that are being exploited in segregated workplaces and institutional care.
So we know that these kinds of practices leave really terrible scars on people's lives and also create enduring social and economic costs for the community more broadly. Based on the numbers that we now have and using a methodology from developed by UK Home Office researchers, it looks like the cost of modern slavery to the state is somewhere between $956 million and $9.6 billion. That large range being because of the varying estimates of the population of victims of modern slavery. But that said, despite those big numbers, 16,400 in New South Wales, 41,000 in the country, a cost of somewhere between 1 and 10 billion, we think there's really important momentum emerging in New South Wales now, particularly because of the adoption of the Modern Slavery Act 2018, which really just came into force last year. And that momentum is giving us an opportunity to ensure that everyone in our state enjoys real freedom from slavery.
I guess the challenge that we have now is to build a community of purpose to achieve that real change. Like James said, that it's more than just words, that it's actually a practical thing. And the strategic plan sets out the Commissioner's roadmap for the next 3 years and explains what we've heard in the consultation since September 2022, the 5 priorities that emerged and the actions that we will take to achieve those priorities and how they fit with Australia's existing national action plan to combat modern slavery. So we're just going to go through the 5 priorities.
Great. So the first priority is building prevention capacity. We know that modern slavery is massively underreported. There are around 300 reports of modern slavery each year. Interestingly, about 40% of those are reports of forced marriage. But we also know, as Elise mentioned, that there are perhaps 41,000 people living in modern slavery in Australia. So 300 reports, 41,000 cases. That's just a massive reporting gap, something I'm sure that you in the domestic and family violence ecosystem area know all too much about. At the moment in the anti-slavery area, our system is largely set up reactively. So the system is set up to wait for cases of modern slavery to be reported, usually to the police, and then there's some kind of systemic reaction. But of course, by that point, that there is a recognition that the terrible abuse happening to someone constitutes modern slavery, human trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage, forced marriage. By that point, the harm has already been done. So what we heard consistently across all our consultations with over 2,500 people as we prepared this strategic plan is we need to get much, much better at prevention.
So to help make this happen, we will focus on action in two areas. First, we will undertake the first formal population level study of who's being victimised by modern slavery in New South Wales in collaboration with the NOUS group. James will also be writing to many stakeholders, including hopefully you guys, in the coming weeks to seek help and guidance in these efforts. And then we'll move to develop a hotline arrangement to support survivors of modern slavery as well. This is actually required by the Modern Slavery Act. In the months ahead, we'll also be drawing on international best practice to develop a workable and effective arrangement here in New South Wales.
And second, we're going to work to equip frontline workers. So, for example, research overseas suggests that up to 80% of people who are trafficked present to a healthcare worker while they are being exploited. But we don't have any systems in place right now in the New South Wales health system, public or private, to screen for that risk exposure and then to capture that risk exposure and to refer people to appropriate treatment pathways. So we've announced the start of a new initiative, which we've called It's Healthy to Fight Slavery, that's bringing together healthcare sector actors to develop screening and diagnostic, clinical, referral and public health responses to modern slavery.
Particularly passionate about that one because I was one of those people that intersected with healthcare in my time. Our second priority is to enable remedy. And during the consultations, we heard that people often feel trapped by the legacies of modern slavery in their lives and are unable to get free from that and experience real freedom, even months and years after their experience. We heard that many survivors struggle to access the essential services such as housing, primary care, and legal and financial advice that they need to recover.
So over the next 3 years, we're going to try to work to improve that access. First, by putting survivors at the heart of our policy and program design and delivery efforts. We think that that will simply make the efforts more effective, more efficient, while also supporting the healing and recovery of people with lived experience. We'll pay survivors for their time and expertise, and we'll provide them trauma-informed safeguards and skills development, whether they're employees in my team, as Sarah is, or indeed members of the new advisory panel that I'm going to come on to shortly. For context, this approach of involving people with lived experience as peer employees, peer personnel in organisations, having them take leadership roles in these organisations, this approach is surprisingly new in this space in New South Wales. And I think one area where in particular anti-slavery organisations are going to be looking to the domestic and family violence space to understand what that journey looks like to really empower safely people with lived experience in the response process and sector itself.
So we'll also be taking practical steps to improve access to remedy, beginning with housing. During our consultations, we discovered that many survivors are trapped in exploitation because they don't have access to safe, secure, and in some cases culturally appropriate and affordable housing. We heard that housing is a human right, but everyone actually needs a home. Without that, people often have to choose between continuing to live in exploitative situations and homelessness.
And obviously that's a choice that no one should face. So we've begun working with a range of actors to consider what kinds of solutions might be possible for both short and longer term stay arrangements. I also wrote recently to the co-chairs of the new government task force that I'm sure you're all very well briefed on, that's looking at expanding access for victims of domestic and family violence to the Shared Equity Homebuyer Helper program, simply to encourage them to factor modern slavery into their work. And I was pleased to receive a response from Minister Harrison just last week, acknowledging that input and forwarding the information to the members of the task force. So we look forward to continued engagement there. What we think that points to is that government has a really key role to play in addressing modern slavery risks, not only as a regulator, but also by using, frankly, its commercial leverage. And that brings us to the third priority in our strategic plan, which is fostering responsible business practices.
New South Wales is taking big steps to make this happen. Over 400 public organisations now have a legal obligation to remove products of modern slavery from their supply chains.
So since September last year, I've been working with all New South Wales government departments, local councils, and a range of other public organisations to develop a framework that will help them manage modern slavery risk in their public procurement. We're getting very close now to publishing the formal guidance that's come out of those consultation processes. And we're hopeful that that will be endorsed by the New South Wales Procurement Board, which is relevant perhaps for some of you because it may, for example, impact the way that commissioning arrangements work between the Department of Communities and Justice and some of you. We'll then move on to the process of implementation of that framework, that guidance that we'll be publishing, which includes for us receiving and assessing probably over 400 reports annually on the due diligence efforts that those organisations are undertaking. We'll be supporting training and skills development, and we'll be consulting, as required by the law, with the Procurement Board and the Auditor General to ensure the effectiveness of all of that work.
And of course, it's not only public entities that have a key role to play in addressing modern slavery risks in supply chains. We also see private buyers, investors, and industry associations as critical. New South Wales is already home to a number of world-leading anti-slavery business initiatives like Fair Supply, I should say, a global leader in supply chain risk analysis. And leading members of the Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking Asia Pacific, a group of institutional investors with over 8.2 trillion Australian dollars in assets under management.
So that's a pretty big number, but we actually think there's even more that we can do here in New South Wales, given the concentration of capital and financial services. So I'm just in the process right now of convening a financial sector roundtable to consider how we can support this sector to do more. Whether it's banks, institutional investors, credit unions, insurers, or others. And later this year, I'll be moving to exercise a power I have under the Act to issue a code of practice for managing modern slavery risks in a particularly high-risk supply chain. And I'm going to make a few announcements about that in the next couple of weeks.
I guess changing gears, let's address how we talk about modern slavery. Our fourth priority is to change the narrative and to make the case for anti-slavery in a way that actually empowers survivors. Many people that we spoke to during our consultations, and I include myself in this, are really concerned that stereotypes of modern slavery impede effective identification and risk further harm. There's a general lack of awareness of modern slavery risks and responses, and survivors often tell me, and I include myself in this again, that we didn't know that we were experiencing modern slavery because it didn't fit those stereotypes.
So we're going to do what we can over the next 3 years to try to raise awareness of modern slavery across the state in multiple languages through ethical storytelling that empowers survivors.
Which then brings us to our fifth and final priority, which simply put is all of you.
So our analysis at the office is that modern slavery is really a system failure. As I was explaining before, there's a relationship between modern slavery offences and other offences, whether it's domestic and family violence or in a more commercial setting, it may be workplace offences. If we get to a point that's so extreme that it actually does legally constitute modern slavery, we've failed along the way to recognise other things going on, intervene and prevent them getting worse, failed to remedy those, I hate to say it, but upstream violations, if I can put it that way. So what that means is that that system failure requires system change. And the only way you're going to get a system change is through collective action, which is why the title of the strategic plan is Working Together for Real Freedom.
And so to foster that community of purpose, we're taking 2 steps. First, we introduced at the launch of the strategic plan the first intake of members for the new advisory panel to the Commissioner. 20% of the panelists have lived experience of modern slavery, and all of the panelists are entitled to be paid for their time and to appropriate trauma-informed counselling and other supports.
So we don't have the names there on the slide, but there's a range of people from the business world, unions, legal advisory services, the migrant and settlement services area, multicultural responses, anti-slavery area, of course, clinical psychology, finance, you name it, a very broad array of experience. And what I'm really excited to tell you is that, as Sarah said, that was the first intake. We actually have live right now expressions of interest for the second intake of the advisory panel, and they are open for about another 2 weeks till the end of July. If you're interested to know more about the advisory panel or how to apply to be one of the members of the advisory panel, I think we have a QR code coming up at the end so get your phones ready, that you can follow to get further details. Or if you can't find it for some reason, you can email us at anti-slavery, all one word, anti-slavery @justice.nsw.gov.au, and you'll find, and just let us know and we'll be happy to share more details. You might be thinking though, well, our advisory panel, not really my cup of tea. I'm on enough committees. I'd rather get more involved in something, a bit bigger, that's a bit more solutions focused. Thank you for putting that in the chat, the email address. The good news is that the panel isn't the only way you can get involved. We'll also be convening twice a year a 2-day anti-slavery forum, a chance for people coming together to fight slavery in New South Wales, to support each other, to learn, to network, and to innovate. So the first forum will take place in probably November of this year, and we'll be sharing more details soon. We'll share again the link to our website at the end of this presentation coming up shortly, and you can sign up for our newsletter there as well, which will share all of this information with you.
So I guess there we have it, 5 priorities, each with a series of named actions. And in the coming months, we will formalise those actions as projects with specific targets and milestones. As required by the Act, the Commissioner will report to Parliament each year on the progress under this plan.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. So there is the promised QR code and a few more details of places you can find us. But I'm actually going to just stop sharing my screen and hand back to Elise. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, James and Sarah. We really appreciate your presentation, being able to hear more about the work of your planning process, being able to hear about the things you were hearing on the ground from people with lived experience of modern slavery is really useful. We draw so much on lived expertise in the domestic and family violence sector as well, and we know how important that is to guide the remedies. And what's really fabulous is to see the broad scope of your strategy, from working with governments and businesses to looking at responses as well as prevention. Fabulous to see how much diversity you have in your advisory group, and it's fabulous also to hear that there are opportunities to kind of for people who might be interested to join that group. So I'm sure there are people listening who are working with clients who've experienced modern slavery who might be interested in joining. James, I think you still might have your screen share on, so maybe I'll prompt you.
I don't think it's me. I think it might be someone called Tara Hunter, possibly.
Oh, all right. Well, I might just see if. Oh, that's right. It is. Okay. Tara, I'll just hope that you can possibly sort that out for us. Thank you so much. Technology, it's a challenge, isn't it?
It is. Constant companion.
We've got plenty of time to have a bit of a discussion, and so I'd like to invite the other people who've been listening to the presentation to share any comments or questions that you might have. Please feel free to unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and share, or people are welcome if you prefer to pop a question or a comment in the chat. Whilst people are thinking, I might, kind of get us started with a first question. And James, I'm wondering what intersections you see between the work that you're doing and the work of the domestic and family violence sector, and in particular, given that we engage in a lot of advocacy in our sector, what can we do to support the advocacy and the awareness raising that we both need to do in this space?
Thanks, Elise. So I'll say a little bit about the intersections that we see at the office, but then perhaps invite Sarah also to talk from her experience. So Sarah perhaps can tell you also a little bit about an organisation that she's recently been developing called Survivor Connections, which is about peer engagement and support amongst survivors of modern slavery. I think empirically what we're seeing as we increasingly get to know the diversity of experiences of modern slavery in New South Wales is that there's just massive empirical overlap between these two victim populations. So many people who are experiencing modern slavery have arrived there through experiences of domestic or family violence. Of course, if they're involved in forced marriage or exposed to threats of forced marriage, that can itself in some ways be understood as a form of family violence. That's certainly the conceptual and legislative approach that, and indeed response approach that is taken in Victoria. But in New South Wales, it is more of a criminal-led response to forced marriage. And I think that's a very important policy issue that we'll all need to think about over the next few years. Traditionally, anti-slavery responses have been criminal justice led. They are not led by the social service organisations broadly understood traditionally. Now, that is a very big high-level picture view. When you start diving down into that, you see numerous organisations, some of which may be on this call, that are doing really important key work to identify and support this victim population. But often those are organisations that are themselves involved in responding to domestic and family violence. Many of the people who present, who are identified as victims of modern slavery and human trafficking, are not presenting in those terms themselves. They don't necessarily perceive themselves as victims of modern slavery and human trafficking. The concept, frankly, the terminology of slavery is so alien to us today, so unthinkable, that people don't really think, oh, this is what's happening to me. They're focused, frankly, on the day-to-day survival and day-to-day well-being needs, and not thinking about where it falls in different legal categorizations. Then at the other end, what we see is when people have been subjected to forms of exploitation that qualify as modern slavery, anecdotally, I would say, because we don't yet have the data, they're at much greater risk of domestic and family violence. They are deeply traumatized psychologically by their exploitation. Their agency has been stripped away through coercive control, manipulation, often physical abuse, frequently by financial abuse. So they're not only traumatized, they're financially and socially, if I can put it that way, traumatized as well. They're probably not in a good place financially. They're probably not in a good place in terms of housing options. So again, there just needs to be massive integration, if I can put it that way, of what we're doing in our space with what you've already been building, so that we're not siloed from what you're doing, so that we are learning from the good practices emerging in the domestic and family violence space, and so that we're not competing, to be frank, with what you're doing, given finite resourcing arrangements. So I think if you were listening to many of the themes coming through our presentation on the strategic plan, a lot of it is about mobilization, building a community of purpose. So creating a shared sense of what it is that we're collectively trying to achieve and what good system change looks like. And then equipping people with the resources, the tools, the frameworks, the benchmarks, the learning opportunities to, over time, professionalize that community in a sense and have a shared sense of what our goals are. I think for us in a young office, something that really drove this home and how much we have to learn from your community was a week in, I think it was beginning of May. It seems a lifetime ago now, frankly, but that's only 2 months. But I think it was the beginning of May. On the Monday, we and many others from the anti-slavery world attended a conference in Canberra convened by federal authorities, thinking about what trauma-informed practice looks like in the criminal justice response to modern slavery in the country. And on I think it was Thursday, Friday, you can probably correct me, I attended I and many members of my team attended the Wollongong conference on healing and recovery in the DFB space. And while there's fabulous work going on in each place, the nature of the meeting was completely different in the two spaces. In the anti-slavery space, for example, Sarah was the only person with lived experience self-disclosed in a room of 100 people. And for all of you who attended the Wollongong meeting, you know how that was not the case. I think at one point, these numbers might not be quite accurate, but at one point I heard that there were 400 people there and half of them had disclosed lived experience. And the impact that had on the nature of the discussion, the tone of the discussion, the honesty, I'll be forthright about that, the honesty of the discussion is fundamental to empowering people to take agency back. And that's fundamentally what we have to be trying to achieve in the anti-slavery space. Slavery is the theft of people's agency. So our responses need as one of their key goals to be empowering of the people that we're serving. I've gone on for too long. You can see I'm passionate about this, Elise, but maybe Sarah has something she'd like to share.
Yeah, I'll probably just add a little bit of colour to what you mentioned about the intersections between domestic violence and this issue in particular. Obviously, my own experience was that it was a domestic violence relationship that not only socially isolated me, but made me financially desperate enough to kind of get caught up in a situation that turned into a modern slavery situation. But I also have many survivor friends that have had experience of domestic violence either before or after escaping from a situation of exploitation. And I think, I mean, obviously, again, that, as James said, that's anecdotal, but we're seeing that basically the same vulnerabilities, and I know that some people are not keen on that word, but the same things that I guess put you in a position where you might be vulnerable to these kinds of people are kind of the same, whether that's social isolation because of a breakdown in family situations at home, and that makes young people vulnerable to, say, I'm hearing stories from people of young people being groomed on Tinder, even for, say, sexual exploitation, or, I guess, whether they're isolated because they've moved here as an international student, and the same way that they would be vulnerable to, say, a domestic violence relationship, they could be groomed and exploited by someone in sort of a modern slavery situation. And I guess that comes back to that whole idea that we have about shifting the narrative around this. Myself and many of the people that I work with, as James mentioned, about a month ago, we started a support group, I suppose it is to start off with, and a bit of a resource for survivors of modern slavery. And we run a support group where people share their experiences and their recovery journeys. But they all kind of tell us the same thing, that, you know, one person said to me, why has no one told me that this is what I was experiencing? Because I just didn't know. The same way that in the domestic and family violence space, you know, we had that narrative of, but he didn't hit me. A lot of people are not understanding that this can happen in many different ways. Particular things that I think of that might intersect with your sector are, you know, what we call the lover boy model of grooming and exploitation, where people essentially groom someone into a relationship, or a romantic or a sexual relationship, and then exploit them, either by forcing them to work in the sex industry commercially, or whether they're forcing them into other abusive situations where they're taking their money from work and those kinds of things. So, and often these kind of people will possibly present to your services saying that they're in a, you know, because they're in an abusive relationship, but there is that added element of a sort of modern slavery situation going on. Like James said, also the forced marriage and some of the other complexities around those kinds of situations obviously will intersect with you guys. But I guess the main thing is that I always encourage people to understand that some of those misconceptions about what this looks like actually stop people from being able to self-identify as being a victim of this, and also that the perpetrators can be varied. It could be a neighbor, it could be a friend. Many people experience trafficking and exploitation by family members even. So again, I think it's a chance just to have a deeper look and understand the different ways that this sort of thing might present in your sector. So yeah, that's probably all I have to say on that.
Thanks, Sarah and James. So much of the work to be done in the next 3 years is about awareness raising. And there was one thing that you mentioned in your presentation earlier, that, you know, people are having to choose between homelessness and a situation where they're being exploited. And we hear the same thing so much in our sector, that people are having to choose between being in an abusive relationship, an abusive home, or homelessness. So there's certainly, like you say, you know, some work that we can do that is going to address, you know, both slavery and domestic and family violence. Well, our audience are warming up a little bit. We've got a few questions now popping up in the chat. The first kind of you know, area that people would like to hear more about is the intersection between sexual violence and modern slavery. Is there anything that you can share in addition on that?
Shall I take that one, James? Or do you want to take that one?
Sure, Sarah. So there are a number of offences under both Commonwealth and state law that are captured in this rubric of modern slavery offences. There's a list of them in, I think it's Schedule 2 of the Modern Slavery Act 2018 of New South Wales. And at the state law level, many of the offences described as modern slavery offences are actually focused on different forms of sexual violence and exploitation and abuse, which range, of course, widely from sexual servitude to online sexual exploitation. Sadly, it appears that Australia is amongst the top 3 places for perpetrators, nearly always male, but not only, of online sexual abuse of minors offshore, particularly in Southeast Asia. So there's a wide range of forms of sexual abuse and violence and indeed exploitation covered here. But as Sarah was mentioning, there are also other forms of domestic exploitation that are not sexualized that end up constituting modern slavery. So that might include domestic servitude, which sadly often does involve family members, usually extended family members, and other such offences. Yeah, I hope that provides a pointer.
Just to, I guess, I know that the question was particularly about sexual violence. I think one of the things that, because I work across or do advocacy in the sexual violence space as well as domestic and family violence spaces, I think one of the things that I'm noticing that people don't necessarily have an understanding of is, you know, when they sexual violence and abuse crosses those lines to become a situation of sexual exploitation, and there's a lot of confusion, and I think a lot of people aren't recognizing when and how that happens. So I think I guess We also see, people sort of getting very confused around some of the intersex with commercial sex work that is legal versus what is not legal. And I think the key point there is that obviously New South Wales is a decriminalised state, so commercial sex work is legal unless someone is being forced to do that against their will, and that could be someone, like I said, someone's partner forcing them to do commercial sex work in form of, say, OnlyFans online, or any situation where someone is being is forced to commit sexual acts for the profit of that other person. And yeah, so I think that's a really key point, that we understand the intersect between, where does the affirmative consent and those new laws also come into play when it comes to sex work and sexual exploitation.
Thanks, Sarah. And consent is such a difficult, is such a complex issue, particularly when someone is dependent on another person for their visa or for financial support or for their housing. So, whether or not someone is consenting or not is something that has to be really scrutinised.
Yeah, and Elise, if I can just jump in on that, I think one area that I increasingly suspect may get attention in the years ahead is exactly that point, how the concept of consent and what the law expects of the quote unquote reasonable person varies in different circumstances and depending on victim characteristics, but also how that is and isn't being operationalized. So a couple of the offences that are modern slavery offences actually have this reasonable person test at their heart, that the offence is only made out if the reasonable person believed or would have believed that they were not free to leave, for example, or free to decline the instruction. How that is actually being operationalised by frontline police is a very important question. Once an offence that presents to police is recognised as a modern slavery or trafficking offence per se, as opposed to sexual assault, for example, it is under the existing arrangements between the state and federal police, it is passed off to the federal police. Now there's a good argument for that. The federal police have built up expertise around trafficking and slavery issues over time. But on the other hand, federal police are by their nature more remote from what's happening on the ground. By the time that's happened, because very few people present directly to the federal police, they almost always, if they present to the police, are going in through the state police or territory police. So by the time they're passed on to the AFP, they've already probably done a number of interviews or statements. There's risk of re-traumatization along the way, and then they're passed off to the AFP for the AFP to again understand the nature of the case and make an assessment about whether they should be recommended for inclusion in this Support to Traffic People program. The federal government has indicated that it will be piloting a new approach to people getting into the Support to Traffic People program, the federally funded support program, that won't go through the AFP. It'll go through a non-policing agency. The details of that are yet to be announced. That might assist with some of this, but what it doesn't answer is the question that I see Freya's asked in the chat around where do the state police fit in? What I would say is that we're early in our days of developing a relationship with the New South Wales Police Force, to be frank. We're a very new entity. It will take time to establish understanding and trust there. But what we've seen in our engagement with them is an encouraging recognition that all of the work that is going in now and will continue to be going into cultural, institutional, operational reform around coercive control is directly relevant to identifying on the front line people who may additionally be at risk of these modern slavery offences. So I'm encouraged that there is there's the right orientation and understanding there at senior levels of the police force. Now the work ahead is to make sure that translates to frontline skills and that they're deployed effectively. What we hear frequently is that that's not currently the case. And I'm not just talking about New South Wales here. I'm talking about all of the anecdota that we hear from across the country, that frequently people who turn out to be victims of modern slavery are not recognised as such by frontline police or other agencies. There is important work being done by the federal police to try and train agencies across the country in what it looks like to be able to effectively recognise a person presenting with modern slavery. But as you heard in our strategic plan, where we think we can actually add more value and move the needle more is probably not in the policing area. We think that there are a range of other service providers that are on the front line having contact with people who are victimised by modern slavery, whether that's healthcare, social workers, psychologists, people in the housing sector. They also are not being encouraged or trained to be able to identify and assist those people. So we're going to be starting with the healthcare sector, where we think we can get most bang for our buck.
Thanks, James. And, you know, you've got to be realistic about what we can achieve in 3 years. I think it's wise to target those professions where you think you're going to make the greater inroads, but also the opportunity to use the work that the police are doing around coercive control over the next, few years is really valuable as well. The last thing that we might perhaps, it might be useful to touch on before we finish up is maybe the intersection with people who are on temporary visas. We know in our sector that this is a really vulnerable group of people who can't access Medicare, can't access Social Security, are often restricted from being able to earn an income, and therefore have many challenges in accessing the crisis housing, support services. So if anything you want to share on that issue or the work that you might be doing to address and support that population?
Sure. It's a critical area for us. That said, because I'm a state level actor, my mandate stops at the water's edge, so to speak. I don't have a mandate formally on federal matters such as in foreign affairs and so on. And the landscape, as you all know, is rapidly shifting around what remedies and protections are available for a range of migrant and visa categories. We are certainly keeping a very close eye on those developments, and we have publicly supported the work of the Migrant Justice Institute, or perhaps its initiative, that Bettina Farbenblum and Laurie Berg at UTS lead. Around whistleblower protections in particular for migrant workers. The ability to safely speak up and draw federal and other authorities' attention to workplace abuse and vulnerability is really critical. It's probably one of the key reasons modern slavery and in particular forced labour debt bondage cases are significantly underreported in this country. So we're very keen to see that any reforms that come forward from the federal government provide those protections and assurance for migrant workers, international students, others on temporary visas, that if they report concerns to the relevant authorities, their visa status is not going to be imperiled, and that they're going to be provided other protections so that their family members back at home, for example, are not imperiled, which at the moment they frequently are. We see this issue of vulnerability around visa status and lack of access to social services because of visa status arising all the time in the cases presenting to us. Our job is not to investigate or resolve specific cases. It's really more structural and thematic under the legislation. That said, I am empowered to collect information and to ensure that people who present get referred to the right places for support and assistance. And often that process of gathering that information from the relevant authorities has a certain attention focusing impact on those authorities on a particular case, which is often quite helpful to those people. So again, not a lot I can say publicly there for confidentiality and privacy reasons, but it's something we're very actively engaging with in our incoming inquiries work. And if any of you do encounter people, have clients service users, beneficiaries who you think may be potentially people with lived experience of modern slavery. We would encourage you to let them know that they can come forward to us for assistance and support, and we can refer them on very carefully to the relevant places. I take a great personal interest in this work. I spend a lot of time every week working directly with survivors of modern slavery to understand their needs and to make sure that they are being listened to. They frequently, I guess I can say this, but Sarah will correct me if she thinks it's wrong. I see a lot of people who don't feel they're being listened to. And I think that's actually one of the key things for us establishing credibility in the space, is to listen to the people with lived experience, and not only listen, but hear and then take action based on what we're hearing.
And I think just to add to that, I think just with my work with other survivors and Survivor Connections is obviously our little support group it's in its infancy, but one of the biggest things that I do a lot, and I get a lot of phone calls or messages from people that are particularly because of their migration status or because they're an international student and they're not eligible for so many supports. There's this constant need for I guess, to be creative, to try and find support services to help them, but oftentimes that doesn't happen so much in the modern slavery sector. So I often look outside of the modern slavery sector for that kind of support, and both the sexual and domestic and family violence spaces have been hugely supportive in that. I think it's also worth mentioning that this perception that once people get out, the same as what you would see, people going back or people being vulnerable to another situation of, say, domestic violence, or in this case, exploitation, is something that is an ongoing problem, because the same things that made that situation happen for them to start with often are continuing situations. They are still an international student who's restricted for the amount of hours they can work, or they are still a person who's socially isolated because of family breakdown. So those kind of cyclical re-exploitation situations do come up quite often. So yeah, we do try and be really creative about engaging with other sectors for help in those situations.
So much, Sarah. Yes, those risk factors don't disappear overnight. Absolutely. Well, look, we've just popped the link to the strategy in the chat for anyone who would like to take another look, and grateful to you, James, for also popping that other link in the chat. Thank you both so much for coming along and sharing this with our members. It's been a really informative session, and I'm sure that many of us will be prompted to go away and do some further reading and research, and perhaps encouraging people to reach out for the advisory group intake, or attending the forum to be happening later in November. Really appreciate your time today, and thank you to everyone who came along.
Thank you.